In April of 1942, only months after the devastation of Pearl Harbor, when much of the world believed the United States had been pushed onto the defensive and the Pacific Ocean belonged to Imperial Japan, something happened that should have been impossible. From the empty horizon, far beyond the reach of any known American airfield, bombers suddenly appeared over Tokyo itself. Air raid sirens screamed across the capital of an empire that had been told it was untouchable, and for the first time in the war, Japanese citizens looked up and realized that distance, oceans, and victory at Pearl Harbor had not protected them at all. The attack caused limited physical destruction, but its real impact was psychological. America had crossed an ocean and struck back sooner than anyone believed possible, proving that the nation Japan thought unprepared was already learning how to fight a completely different kind of war. Just months earlier, American forces had seemed shaken and disorganized, still mobilizing, still converting factories and industries for wartime production, while Japanese naval power dominated vast stretches of the Pacific. Many Japanese leaders believed time was on their side, convinced that American society lacked the endurance for a prolonged conflict. Yet beneath that perception, shipyards were working without pause, engineers were redesigning aircraft for missions never attempted before, and logisticians were solving a problem no military had ever faced at such scale: how to move an entire war machine across the largest ocean on Earth. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's daring plan to launch medium bombers from an aircraft carrier embodied this transformation. The idea sounded reckless, even absurd, because no bomber of that size had ever taken off from such a short deck, and success depended not only on courage but on planning so precise that failure seemed inevitable. When the American task force was detected earlier than expected by Japanese patrol vessels, the mission became even more dangerous. The crews were forced to launch hundreds of miles farther from Japan than planned, knowing they might not have enough fuel to survive the journey afterward. One by one, the bombers accelerated down the pitching deck of the carrier, every takeoff balanced between flight and catastrophe, until the final aircraft lifted into the sky and disappeared toward the Japanese homeland. Hours later, bombs fell on Tokyo and other cities, shocking a nation that had believed the war would remain far from its shores. The raid demonstrated something far more significant than military damage. It revealed that American reach was expanding rapidly, supported by coordination, innovation, and logistical planning operating on a global scale. As the war moved deeper into the Pacific, Japanese soldiers began encountering the full meaning of what that raid had foreshadowed. On islands like Guadalcanal, where brutal fighting unfolded in dense jungle heat, Japanese troops sometimes advanced into abandoned American positions expecting intelligence documents or discarded weapons. Instead, they discovered vast stores of supplies carefully organized and continuously replenished. Food in quantities unimaginable to men who often fought while starving, medical equipment ready for immediate use, spare uniforms, ammunition, machinery, and engineering tools that suggested an army prepared not merely to survive but to remain indefinitely. Bulldozers carved airstrips from jungle terrain within days, damaged equipment was replaced rather than repaired, and fresh shipments arrived across thousands of miles of open ocean with astonishing regularity. For soldiers trained to believe victory depended primarily on endurance and sacrifice, this abundance was deeply unsettling. It suggested that they were not facing an enemy that would weaken over time, but one growing stronger with every engagement. Behind each American soldier stood shipbuilders, factory workers, farmers, engineers, and millions of civilians whose combined effort transformed industry itself into a decisive weapon. The United States had turned logistics into strategy, ensuring that momentum never stopped, that wounded soldiers were evacuated, that reinforcements arrived, and that every captured island became another stepping stone forward. Gradually, a realization emerged among many Japanese units fighting across the Pacific. Courage alone could not overcome a system capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. The war was no longer decided solely by battlefield bravery, but by the ability of a nation to sustain conflict across unimaginable distances. The Doolittle Raid had been the first warning, a glimpse of what American organization and industrial strength could achieve, and the supply depots scattered across Pacific islands became undeniable proof that the United States was fighting with the power of an entire civilization moving as one. By the final years of the war, The outcome was shaped not only by battles won but by endurance maintained. American victory in the Pacific was built on planning, cooperation, and the determination of millions working far from the front lines yet connected to every soldier overseas. Across oceans once thought impassable barriers, ships continued to arrive, airfields continued to rise, and the flow of supplies never ceased. For many who faced it, the moment they discovered American logistics was the moment they understood that they were no longer fighting just an army, but a nation whose strength lay in unity, innovation, and an unbreakable capacity to sustain the fight until victory was achieved. As American forces pushed farther across the Pacific, each new island revealed the same astonishing pattern. Wherever they landed, infrastructure followed. Harbors appeared where only coral reefs had existed, floating docks transformed empty shorelines into supply hubs, and within days aircraft were taking off from runways carved out of mud and jungle. For Japanese soldiers isolated in defensive positions, the speed of this transformation felt unreal. Battles that were meant to exhaust the enemy instead seemed to strengthen him. Every destroyed aircraft was replaced, every damaged ship returned repaired or substituted by another, and every American advance carried with it an invisible force, the certainty that reinforcements were already on their way long before they were needed. The Pacific Ocean, once believed to be Japan's greatest shield, had become a highway controlled by American industry. Nowhere was this realization more devastating than during the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal. Japanese troops, many weakened by disease and starvation, watched American supply ships arrive relentlessly while their own reinforcements struggled to reach the island under cover of darkness. The contrast was impossible to ignore. American soldiers received regular rations, medical care, and rotation away from the front, while Japanese units were ordered to hold positions regardless of hunger or exhaustion. Diaries recovered after the battles described disbelief as much as fear, noting how the enemy seemed endlessly supported, as if the war itself favored one side with resources beyond imagination. What had begun as confidence slowly turned into a grim understanding that endurance alone could not defeat an opponent sustained by an entire continent's productive power. The pattern repeated itself across the Pacific campaign. At Saipan, Okinawa, and countless smaller islands, American engineers landed alongside combat troops, turning chaos into organization with remarkable speed. Portable hospitals saved lives that would once have been lost, allowing wounded soldiers to return home rather than disappear into the statistics of war. Massive naval task forces operated with coordination never before seen, refueling at sea and maintaining constant pressure. Even small details carried psychological weight. Fresh mail delivered from home, hot meals prepared near front lines, and equipment replaced before failure could cost lives. These were not luxuries but evidence of a military philosophy built around sustaining morale as much as winning territory. For many Japanese defenders, the realization became unavoidable during the later stages of the war. They were facing not only superior firepower but a system designed to outlast any resistance. American bombers filled the skies in increasing numbers, supported by airfields that seemed to multiply overnight, while fleets of ships stretched across the horizon in formations so vast they redefined the scale of modern warfare. Reports reaching Japanese command described an enemy capable of absorbing losses without slowing, advancing methodically with a momentum that felt unstoppable. The psychological balance of the war shifted. Victory was no longer imagined through decisive battle but feared as an approaching certainty. Back in the United States, millions of civilians unknowingly shaped these moments. Workers in Detroit assembled aircraft at astonishing speed, shipbuilders launched vessels faster than enemy submarines could sink them, and families rationed at home so soldiers abroad would never lack what they needed. The connection between factory floor and battlefield became direct and immediate, transforming ordinary citizens into participants in a global struggle. Every crate unloaded on a distant island carried with it the effort of countless hands, reinforcing a simple but powerful truth. American strength came not from one weapon or one commander, but from collective purpose. As the war neared its conclusion, the overwhelming logistical power that Japanese soldiers had first glimpsed years earlier became undeniable reality. The United States had learned how to project strength across oceans, sustain armies indefinitely, and adapt faster than any opponent expected. What began with a daring strike over Tokyo evolved into a relentless advance supported by planning, innovation, and unity on a scale the world had never witnessed. For those who faced it on the battlefield, the discovery of American logistics marked more than a tactical disadvantage. It marked the moment they understood that the balance of the war had permanently shifted, and that the outcome was being decided not only by courage in combat, but by the unmatched ability of a nation to stand behind every soldier it sent into battle. As American forces advanced deeper into the Pacific, the scale of the conflict expanded beyond anything previously imagined by military planners on either side. Entire fleets moved like floating cities across the ocean, protected by layers of escort ships, submarines, and aircraft that operated in constant coordination. Japanese observers who once believed the United States would struggle to project power so far from its homeland now witnessed task forces that seemed endless, ships stretching across the horizon in numbers that defied earlier expectations of naval warfare. Each landing operation demonstrated increasing efficiency, as lessons learned from previous battles were rapidly applied to the next, revealing a military capable not only of strength but of adaptation at extraordinary speed. The invasion of the Mariana Islands marked another turning point that deepened this realization. When American forces captured Saipan in 1944, Japanese commanders understood immediately that the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. From these islands, American bombers could now reach the Japanese homeland regularly. For soldiers defending the island, the battle became a desperate struggle fought under relentless bombardment supported by overwhelming logistical coordination. Supplies flowed continuously to American troops while Japanese defenders faced dwindling ammunition and food. Survivors later described the psychological impact of watching enemy aircraft return day after day without interruption, as if the sky itself belonged to the Americans. The war was no longer defined by isolated clashes but by sustained pressure that could not be escaped. At sea, American naval logistics achieved feats once considered impossible. Oilers refueled warships in open waters, allowing fleets to remain operational for months without returning to port. Damaged vessels were repaired at floating bases far from the mainland, returning to combat faster than enemy intelligence believed possible. This ability erased traditional limitations of distance and time, transforming the Pacific into an operational space controlled through movement and supply rather than geography alone. Japanese planners had once relied on vast ocean distances to slow their opponent. Now those same distances amplified American strength. Meanwhile, American air power expanded with relentless momentum. Long-range bombers launched from newly captured bases carried the war directly toward Japan, escorted by fighters produced in staggering numbers. Factories at home operated around the clock, producing aircraft, vehicles, ammunition, and ships at a rate unmatched in history. The scale of production was so immense that entire units could be re-equipped faster than previous generations could have imagined. For Japanese soldiers and civilians alike, the growing presence of American aircraft overhead symbolized something unavoidable. The industrial capacity behind the enemy was too vast to exhaust. Yet alongside machinery and production stood another element that shaped the outcome of the war: the human connection between home and front lines. Letters traveled across oceans, reminding soldiers of the families and communities supporting them. Newsreels and radio broadcasts strengthened morale, reinforcing the belief that every sacrifice contributed to a shared national effort. This unity created resilience that extended beyond battlefield courage, allowing American forces to endure the long, exhausting island campaigns that defined the Pacific War. Even in the harshest conditions, soldiers understood they were backed by a nation fully committed to their survival and success. As the fighting approached Okinawa, one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, the contrast between the two sides reached its most dramatic form. American forces arrived supported by massive naval bombardments, continuous air cover, and logistical networks capable of sustaining prolonged combat despite fierce resistance. Japanese defenders fought with determination, launching desperate counterattacks that reflected the intensity of the conflict, yet the steady flow of American reinforcements and supplies ensured that momentum never faltered. The battle demonstrated that modern warfare had entered a new era, where victory belonged not only to bravery but to the nation capable of sustaining effort without collapse. By this stage of the war, what Japanese soldiers had first glimpsed years earlier had become undeniable reality. The United States had mastered the art of fighting across oceans, transforming industry, science, and organization into decisive instruments of war. Each advance carried forward the accumulated strength of millions working far from combat zones, proving that the outcome of the Pacific War was shaped as much by shipyards and factories as by rifles and battleships. The logistical power once revealed in scattered supply depots had grown into an unstoppable force, steadily closing the distance between battlefield and homeland. And as American forces moved ever closer to Japan itself, the meaning of that discovery became clear to both sides. The war was no longer a contest of isolated victories but a demonstration of sustained national will, powered by innovation, cooperation, and an ability to project strength across the vastest ocean on Earth. What began with shock in the skies over Tokyo had evolved into a relentless advance that reshaped the course of history, leaving behind a lesson that would define modern warfare for generations to come. As American momentum grew across the Pacific, the war transformed into something far larger than a sequence of battles fought over isolated islands. What Japanese commanders had once envisioned as a defensive perimeter began collapsing not through sudden defeat, but through relentless pressure applied with mathematical precision. Each American landing was followed by an almost unbelievable transformation of the environment itself. Beaches that had echoed with gunfire only days before became organized supply zones filled with cranes, fuel lines, communication towers, and rows of equipment waiting for the next advance. To observers on the opposing side, it appeared as though the Americans were not invading islands but rebuilding them in their own image, turning remote outposts into permanent extensions of their operational reach. The scale of coordination required for such operations was unlike anything previously witnessed in warfare. Convoys crossed thousands of miles of open ocean carrying not only weapons but construction materials, vehicles, medical units, and entire engineering battalions. Ships arrived in carefully timed waves, unloading supplies with efficiency that minimized vulnerability and maximized speed. Even under threat of submarine attack or aerial assault, replacements continued arriving. Losses that might have crippled another nation were absorbed and replaced almost immediately, creating the impression of an opponent immune to exhaustion. Japanese soldiers watching from defensive positions began to recognize a disturbing pattern. Every American setback was temporary, while every American success became permanent. This growing realization was reinforced by the changing nature of combat itself. Early in the war, Japanese forces had relied on aggressive offensives and surprise attacks, believing decisive blows could force negotiation. But as American logistics matured, surprise lost its effectiveness. Radar networks expanded, reconnaissance flights increased, and communication systems linked ships, aircraft, and ground forces into a single coordinated structure. Battles became less chaotic and more controlled, shaped by overwhelming preparation long before the first shot was fired. For many Japanese units, engagements felt predetermined, as bombardments softened defenses for days or weeks before landings even began. Meanwhile, American naval power evolved into a moving fortress. Carrier task forces operated with an efficiency that stunned foreign observers, launching waves of aircraft while remaining constantly supplied at sea. Refueling operations allowed fleets to travel extraordinary distances without returning to port, eliminating one of the greatest limitations of earlier naval warfare. The ocean, once an unpredictable barrier, became a controlled operational environment sustained by planning and logistical mastery. Japanese commanders who had hoped to draw American forces into overextension instead found themselves confronting fleets that never seemed to weaken, supported by an invisible network stretching back to factories thousands of miles away. On the home front, the transformation was equally profound. American industry achieved production levels previously considered impossible, as civilian factories converted to wartime manufacturing with remarkable speed. Automobile plants produced tanks and aircraft engines, shipyards launched vessels at unprecedented rates, and technological innovation accelerated under the pressure of global conflict. Workers labored through long shifts, often aware that the equipment they assembled would soon determine the fate of soldiers fighting across distant oceans. This connection between civilian effort and battlefield success created a sense of shared purpose that strengthened morale both at home and abroad, reinforcing the idea that victory depended on collective endurance rather than individual heroics alone. As the campaign moved forward, Japanese forces increasingly faced an enemy whose strength seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Air superiority shifted decisively as American aircraft filled the skies in numbers impossible to counter effectively. New airfields extended operational range, allowing continuous bombardment and reconnaissance that deprived defenders of rest and concealment. The psychological toll grew heavier with each passing month, as soldiers confronted the reality that reinforcements and supplies were becoming rarer while the enemy's presence expanded relentlessly. The war had become a test not only of weapons but of sustainability, and the balance was no longer equal. Even so, resistance remained fierce, and battles across the Pacific were marked by extraordinary determination on both sides. Yet the outcome increasingly reflected structural differences between the nations at war. American forces could pause, reorganize, and prepare for the next operation, while Japanese units were often forced to fight without relief. This contrast deepened the impact of every encounter, reinforcing the perception that one side fought supported by an entire world of resources while the other fought in isolation. The discovery of American logistics was no longer a single moment, but an ongoing realization unfolding across every battlefield of the Pacific. As the American advance pressed onward, the Pacific War entered a phase where distance itself seemed to lose meaning. Islands once marked as distant objectives on strategic maps became stepping stones connected by an ever-expanding chain of supply routes. With every successful landing, the United States shortened the gap between its forces and the Japanese homeland, while simultaneously extending the logistical network that made further advances possible. What had begun as an ambitious response to Pearl Harbor was evolving into a carefully constructed pathway across the ocean, each victory reinforcing the next. Japanese commanders increasingly realized that they were not simply defending territory, they were watching the gradual construction of an unstoppable approach toward Japan itself. The capture of the Mariana Islands represented one of the most decisive moments in this transformation. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, American forces gained positions that allowed long-range bombers to reach the Japanese mainland regularly. For the first time, the war's destructive power could be projected directly into the heart of the empire on a sustained basis. Japanese soldiers defending these islands fought with extraordinary determination, fully aware of their strategic importance, yet the scale of American preparation proved overwhelming. Naval bombardments thundered for days, aircraft dominated the skies, and waves of supplies ensured that attacking forces never lacked ammunition, medical support, or reinforcements. The defenders witnessed an enemy capable of maintaining relentless pressure without pause, a reality that reshaped their understanding of modern warfare. At sea, American logistical innovation continued redefining what fleets could accomplish. Massive floating repair stations allowed damaged ships to return to combat far sooner than expected, while mobile supply groups delivered fuel, ammunition, and provisions directly to task forces operating thousands of miles from traditional bases. The Pacific Fleet no longer depended on distant ports, it carried its own infrastructure with it. This mobility allowed commanders to maintain constant offensive momentum, preventing Japanese forces from recovering between engagements. Battles that might once have provided time for regrouping instead became part of a continuous campaign in which pressure never truly lifted. Meanwhile, American air power expanded into an overwhelming presence. The arrival of new long-range bombers marked a turning point not only militarily but psychologically. These aircraft appeared in growing numbers, supported by airfields constructed with astonishing speed by engineering units working under combat conditions. Entire landscapes were reshaped to support operations, mountains leveled, jungles cleared, and runways extended until they could launch aircraft capable of crossing vast distances. For Japanese observers, the transformation felt almost mechanical in its inevitability, as if the Americans possessed an endless ability to reshape geography itself to serve their strategy. The psychological weight of this expansion grew heavier with each passing month. Reports from the front increasingly described an enemy whose strength seemed immune to attrition. American soldiers rotated out of combat zones, wounded personnel received advanced medical care, and replacements arrived trained and equipped. By contrast, Japanese defenders often faced worsening shortages, isolation, and the knowledge that relief might never come. The contrast created a profound shift in morale, not because courage disappeared, but because the scale of resources behind the opposing force appeared insurmountable. The war was becoming less a contest of battlefield skill and more a demonstration of national endurance measured across industry, logistics, and time. Back in the United States, the machinery sustaining this advance continued accelerating. Shipyards launched new vessels at astonishing speed, sometimes completing construction in weeks rather than months. Factories operated day and night, producing aircraft and equipment in numbers that redefined industrial capability. Women and men who had never imagined themselves connected to warfare became essential participants in a global effort, assembling engines, welding hulls, and packaging supplies destined for distant islands whose names many had never heard before. Every shipment carried across the Pacific represented thousands of individual contributions merged into a single national purpose. As American forces moved closer to Japan, air raids intensified, signaling a new phase of the conflict. Bombers launched from newly secured bases struck industrial centers, transportation networks, and military infrastructure, gradually weakening Japan's ability to sustain prolonged resistance. For civilians and soldiers alike, the growing frequency of these raids reinforced a sobering realization: the war was no longer distant. The same logistical power that had delivered supplies to remote islands was now delivering sustained pressure directly over the Japanese homeland. Yet even amid this escalation, the defining characteristic of the American campaign remained consistency. Operations were planned months in advance, supported by carefully calculated supply projections ensuring that advances would not stall. This methodical approach contrasted sharply with earlier phases of the war defined by sudden offensives and dramatic reversals. Momentum now belonged firmly to the United States, driven by a system designed to maintain forward movement regardless of individual setbacks. The discovery of American logistics, once experienced as isolated shock on scattered battlefields, had become an undeniable strategic reality shaping every aspect of the conflict. And as the Pacific War entered its final and most devastating stage, both sides understood that the struggle had evolved beyond individual battles. It had become a confrontation between two fundamentally different capacities to sustain war itself, one relying on endurance under scarcity, the other powered by coordination, industry, and an ability to project strength across unimaginable distances without losing momentum. By 1945, the Pacific War had reached a scale of destruction and endurance that few could have imagined only 3 years earlier. American forces, now operating with unmatched coordination across sea, air, and land, approached the final defensive perimeter protecting Japan itself. The invasion of Okinawa became the ultimate demonstration of how deeply logistics had reshaped modern warfare. Before troops even set foot on the island, weeks of bombardment softened defenses, supported by fleets so vast they formed an almost continuous presence along the horizon. Supplies flowed endlessly from transport ships to the shore, establishing depots capable of sustaining one of the largest amphibious operations in history. For American soldiers arriving on Okinawa, the infrastructure supporting them was already in motion before the battle began, ensuring that momentum would not falter even in the face of fierce resistance. Japanese defenders understood the importance of the island and fought with extraordinary determination, launching counterattacks and aerial assaults that reflected the desperation of a nation facing invasion. Waves of kamikaze aircraft targeted American ships, creating scenes of chaos and sacrifice across the fleet. Yet even as vessels burned and losses mounted, replacement ships and repair crews continued operating, demonstrating once again the resilience of the logistical system sustaining the campaign. Damaged ships withdrew only briefly before returning to action, and new vessels filled gaps in formation almost as quickly as they appeared. The ability to absorb shock without losing operational strength revealed the true depth of American preparation, reinforcing the sense that the advance could no longer be stopped. On land, the battle became a brutal struggle fought through mud, rain, and fortified positions carved into hillsides. Progress was slow and costly, yet American forces maintained pressure through constant resupply and reinforcement. Ammunition never ran out, medical evacuation saved thousands of wounded, and engineering units rebuilt roads destroyed by combat almost as quickly as they were damaged. For Japanese soldiers entrenched in defensive networks, the realization grew heavier with each passing day. The enemy's strength did not diminish with hardship. Every effort to delay the advance only brought more troops, more equipment, and more firepower forward. The war had become a relentless tide sustained by organization as much as courage. Meanwhile, above the battlefield, American air superiority reached overwhelming levels. Aircraft launched continuously from carriers and nearby airfields, providing reconnaissance, close support, and strategic bombing. The sky itself seemed permanently occupied, removing any illusion of concealment for defenders below. Japanese reports increasingly described an enemy capable of fighting without interruption, supported by resources that appeared limitless. The psychological toll of this constant pressure proved as significant as the physical destruction, eroding hope that the conflict could be reversed through a single decisive action. Far from the front lines, American production continued at full capacity, reflecting a nation that had fully transformed itself for war. Families followed news from the Pacific with growing awareness of the sacrifices being made, while factories maintained an output that ensured soldiers overseas would never face the shortages endured earlier in the conflict. The connection between home and battlefield strengthened morale, creating a shared understanding that victory required persistence from every corner of society. This unity allowed the United States to sustain prolonged operations without losing momentum, reinforcing the logistical advantage that had defined the war's turning points. As Okinawa drew toward its conclusion, the cost of the conflict became impossible to ignore. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the devastation revealed the human price behind strategic success. Yet even amid exhaustion and loss, American forces continued advancing, supported by systems designed to prevent collapse under pressure. Supplies arrived despite storms and attacks, wounded soldiers were evacuated across oceans, and replacements filled ranks with steady reliability. The ability to endure without breaking demonstrated how deeply logistics had become intertwined with survival itself. For Japanese commanders observing these developments, the implications were clear. The United States had achieved something unprecedented: the ability to wage sustained warfare across vast distances while maintaining operational strength. The discovery that began years earlier with shocking encounters on isolated islands had evolved into undeniable reality. American logistics were no longer simply an advantage, they had become the defining force shaping the outcome of the Pacific War. And as preparations began for what many feared would be an invasion of the Japanese mainland, the world stood at a moment of profound uncertainty. The scale of American power now positioned just beyond Japan's shores reflected years of planning, sacrifice, and industrial mobilization. The Pacific Ocean, once believed to be an impenetrable barrier, had been crossed, mastered, and transformed into the pathway through which history itself was moving forward. As the Pacific War approached its final chapter, the immense machinery that had carried American forces across the ocean stood poised at the edge of Japan itself. Years earlier, the empire had believed geography would serve as its ultimate defense, trusting that distance and vast waters would exhaust any enemy bold enough to challenge its expansion. Yet by 1945 that assumption had completely collapsed. American fleets operated freely across waters once dominated by Japanese naval power. Supply routes stretched uninterrupted from the factories of the United States to forward bases only hours away from the Japanese mainland, and the steady rhythm of ships, aircraft, and reinforcements continued without pause. What had begun as a desperate recovery after Pearl Harbor had evolved into a demonstration of national endurance on a scale the world had never witnessed. The transformation was not sudden but cumulative, built step by step through countless decisions made far from the battlefield. Engineers who designed portable harbors, planners who calculated fuel consumption across thousands of miles, workers who assembled aircraft rivet by rivet, and sailors who guided convoys through submarine-infested waters all contributed to a system that allowed American forces to sustain momentum where previous armies would have stalled. Each crate unloaded onto a distant shore represented not only material support, but the coordinated effort of millions working toward a single objective. By the war's final months, logistics itself had become a form of power as decisive as any weapon ever created. For many Japanese soldiers and commanders, the realization that emerged during these final stages was profoundly sobering. The conflict had revealed a new reality of modern warfare. Victory belonged not solely to bravery or tactical brilliance, but to the nation capable of sustaining effort longer, adapting faster, and supporting its forces without interruption. The same logistical strength first hinted at by the daring raid over Tokyo had matured into an overwhelming presence, shaping every battle that followed. What once seemed an isolated shock had become an unavoidable truth visible across the entire Pacific theater. Meanwhile, American servicemen understood that their progress came at tremendous cost. The victories achieved across islands and oceans were measured in sacrifice as much as success, and memories of fallen comrades remained intertwined with every advance. Yet the systems supporting them ensured that those sacrifices were never made in isolation. Medical evacuation chains carried wounded soldiers back across the Pacific to recovery, letters from home continued arriving even in distant combat zones, and the knowledge that an entire nation stood behind them strengthened resolve during the war's darkest moments. The connection between civilian and soldier became one of the defining elements of the American war effort, transforming individual endurance into collective strength. As the war drew toward its conclusion, the world witnessed the culmination of years of industrial mobilization and strategic coordination. The United States had demonstrated an unprecedented ability to project power across global distances while maintaining unity at home, reshaping how future generations would understand warfare itself. Oceans were no longer barriers but avenues of movement, and logistics emerged as the invisible force determining the outcome long before battles were fought. The Pacific Campaign revealed that modern victory depended not only on courage in combat but on preparation, innovation, and cooperation sustained over time. Looking back, the moment Japanese soldiers first encountered American supply depots on remote islands carried a meaning far greater than they could have realized at the time. Those crates of equipment, those organized rows of provisions, and those rapidly constructed airfields represented more than material abundance. They signaled the arrival of a new kind of war, one fought by an entire society moving with shared purpose. The discovery marked the beginning of an understanding that would grow clearer with every passing year of the conflict, that they were facing not merely an opposing army, but a nation capable of sustaining determination across oceans and through unimaginable challenges. From the shock of Pearl Harbor to the daring gamble of the Doolittle Raid, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the final battles near Japan's shores, the story of the Pacific War became a story of transformation. The United States learned, adapted, and ultimately demonstrated that strength could be measured not only by firepower, but by resilience, organization, and unity. In the end, the greatest weapon carried across the Pacific was not a single ship or aircraft, but the collective will of millions working together toward a common goal. And for those who witnessed it unfold, the day Japanese soldiers discovered American logistics was more than a moment of surprise on a distant battlefield. It was the moment the future of the war quietly revealed itself, the realization that an entire nation had learned how to carry its strength across an ocean, and once that movement began, history itself could no longer turn it back.